Good morning, church family. So glad to be with you. It seems like it's been forever since I've had the opportunity to share with you God's Word. But as they say, it's time to get back on the horse and keep going. So we're going to be in the book of Jonah again on Thursdays. And we left off at the end of chapter 1, in which we saw Jonah being swallowed up by a great fish, a great sea monster. And he was swallowed and put in the belly of this great fish. And verse 17 says that he was there for 3 days and 3 nights. So, as I left off last time, I told you we're going to find out what Jonah did for 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of a great fish. And so we're going to start in chapter 2. Chapter 2 is a pretty short chapter. It's 10 verses, so I think I'll read it. It's all one set. So the heading of this chapter is Jonah's prayer. So let me read it to you. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord, his God, from the belly of the fish, saying, I called out to the Lord out of my distress, and he answered me. Out of the belly of Sheol I cried, and you heard my voice. And you cast me into the deep, into the heart of the seas, and the floods surrounded me. All your waves and all your billows passed over me. Then I said, I am driven away from your sight. Yet I shall again look upon your holy temple. The waters closed in over me to take my life. The deep surrounded me. Weeds were wrapped about my head. At the roots of the mountain, I went down to the land, whose bars closed upon me forever. Yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. When my life was fading away, I remembered the Lord, and my prayer came to you, into your holy temple. Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love. But I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you. What I have vowed, I will pay. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, if you recall, Jonah's running from God, disobedient to God's will, and it's brought Jonah to the point where he's been thrown overboard of a ship into the sea, and God has provided a rescue from him in the form of a great fish. And what Jonah's doing here is he's got a little time. And I thought when I read this, and the heading Jonah's prayer, he got a little time on his hand being in a dark place with nothing really to do other than to reflect. And I thought to myself, wow, doesn't this usually happen to us sometimes? We get on this roll and we want to run from God, and we just need a little bit of a correction. And I know as a kid, when I got off on a straight path of my parents, it was sort of a maybe go stand in a corner, fix your attitude type thing. And I thought, well, God has provided Jonah here a little space, his own little prayer closet. Now, I wouldn't go for the prayer closet in the belly of a fish, but nevertheless, Jonah had some time on his hands to reflect just what he's been doing, just how he's run from God. And in verse 2, he acknowledges his prayer, and he acknowledges that God has answered his prayer. He understands that God is there for him. He hasn't run away, even though Jonah's run away. And in verse 3, Jonah acknowledges his sovereignty. And this whole prayer, to be honest with you, is all about God's sovereignty, his love, and his mercy. I can say that every time because this book is just filled with it, of examples of God's sovereignty, grace, and mercy. And I think we see it in our lives every day as well if we think about it. But in verse 3, it says, you cast me into the deep. And it was your waves and your billows that passed over me. So, again, there was a reason why this was happening. There was a reason why God through circumstances, allowed Jonah to be thrown over and thrown into the sea. And we need to understand that it wasn't from verse 5 and 6, they didn't just throw him overboard and the fish is just waiting there with his open mouth and saying, I got you. I mean, Jonah is acknowledging that basically he was continuing on this downward spiral. The downward spiral, which it says, the waters closed in over me to take my life. There was weeds wrapped around my head. So he's struggling for a while in this water. And again, Lord brought a great fish to save him. He got to the point in his own mind where he was being brought down to what it says, the bars were being closed over him forever. He was about to be the bottom of the pit. He was going to be dying. I mean, there was no hope for him. He understood he had sunk so low, run from God so far, that there was nothing that can be done. He sort of accepted his fate. And he was deserving of his fate for running away from God and being disobedient. And as you sort of stop here in the story here, can you think of a time that maybe you've been disobedient to God? Known God's will for your life? To share what God has to say to others? To share the gospel? Have you ever just been so disobedient that you wanted to bury yourself under a table that God couldn't see you? Well, I like what it says in the last part of verse 6. Yet, even though he'd been doing all of these things to get away from God, yet you brought up my life from the pit, O Lord my God. No matter where Jonah was in his disobedience, God still raised him up and gave him life. And it goes on, the last part of verse 9, Jonah acknowledges he's turned his attitude around in his prayer. It says, but I, with the voice of thanksgiving, will sacrifice to you what I vowed I will pay. And it's sort of interesting that now Jonah's on the same page, because if we go back to verse 16 in chapter 1, the sailors who had thrown him over had it says, feared the Lord exceedingly and offered a sacrifice to the Lord and made vows. So Jonah's back on the right path. That path that he took wasn't working so well, but yet God raised him up from the pit. God saved him. And the final words in his prayer, in Jonah's prayer is, as he's cried out, salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, we can use the word salvation here in a spiritual sense, but the word salvation here, this is in a physical sense. So God surely saves us in a physical sense as well as a spiritual sense. But in a physical sense, God has saved Jonah. I mean, he's drowning in a sea. His life he has no hope. But through God's sovereign grace, salvation belongs to the Lord. He decided to save Jonah. He was not done with Jonah. And verse 2 finishes up, and the Lord spoke to the fish, again, God's sovereignty, and it vomited Jonah out upon the dry land. Let's start over again. Jonah prayed for forgiveness, acknowledged his sin, and God raised him up, in effect, forgave his sin, and said, let's try this again. Jonah, let's try again and see if we can't be obedient. So I'll leave you with this. In our lives, we are disobedient. We fall. We run different paths than God's will. But through God's love, mercy, and grace, He allows us to get back on that path. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Have a blessed day, and I look forward to seeing you real soon. God bless.